She was 26 years old, and she had exactly $6, a trunk of mending tools, and no roof that belonged to her when the Talbrook and Prairie Line dismissed her from the only work she had left. Garrett Stroud, the young superintendent who had inherited his grandfather's position and his grandfather's cold arithmetic besides, called in an old company loan against the small trackside cottage where Clementine Ashworth had lived her whole life, and within a month the cottage, the mending shed, and every stitch of equipment her late father had left her belonged to the railroad instead. All she had left, once the company's clerks finished totaling their columns, was that handful of coins and a stubborn refusal to leave Talbrook Junction, Missouri, the only town she had ever called home. So when the railroad auctioned off a derelict boxcar from a forgotten siding at the edge of the yard, its wheels rusted so completely to the rails that 3 men and a team of mules had failed to budge it that spring, Clementine paid $2 for it while the whole auction crowd laughed at a woman fool enough to buy something nobody could even move. It looked like the last, most hopeless purchase a ruined woman could make. But welded into that immovable car was a secret that had waited 60 years in the dark, and what it held would not only give Clementine her life back, it would finally answer for an old and terrible cost the whole town had been quietly paying, without understanding why, for 2 generations. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clementine Ashworth. If you have ever fought to hold on to the one thing everyone told you to let go of, tell us in the comments, we would love to hear it tonight. Clementine had grown up in the particular, rattling music of a rail yard, the daughter of Micah Ashworth, a trimmer and upholsterer whose gentle, exacting hands had spent 30 years fitting leather seats and polished wood paneling into the passenger cars of the Talbrook and Prairie Line. Micah was not a mechanic in the ordinary sense, not a man who understood steam pressure or axle grease, but he possessed something rarer in his own quiet trade, an eye for the seam, the joint, the place where 2 pieces of material had been fitted together, and whether that fitting had been done with care or merely with haste. He taught his daughter almost as soon as she could hold a needle that any craftsman's true signature was not in what showed, but in what didn't, the hidden stitch, the concealed dowel, the panel cut so precisely that a stranger's hand would never find its edge. Anyone can make a thing look finished from the front, Clementine, he used to tell her, turning a scrap of upholstery leather over in the lamplight of their small trackside shop. The measure of a craftsman is what he does where no one will ever look. Clementine absorbed that lesson early and completely, and it shaped her hands and her mind in equal measure. By the time she was 12 she could run her fingers along a length of paneling and tell, faster than her father could, exactly where a repair had been made and how skillfully, and she came to feel, working quietly at his side in the mending shed through her whole girlhood, a private, unshowy pride in noticing what other people walked straight past. The other children of the Yard families thought her a little strange for it, this solemn girl who would rather spend a summer afternoon studying the grain of a discarded plank than playing along the sidings with the rest of them, but Clementine never much minded the distance it put between her and other girls her age. She found, in her father's small, sawdust-scented shop, a kind of order the rest of the world seemed to lack, a place where a torn seam had exactly one correct way of being mended and a poorly fitted joint could always, with enough patience, be made right again. Micah never pushed her toward the trade, exactly, understanding that a daughter might reasonably want something more than her father's quiet, unglamorous work, but he also never discouraged the hours she spent at his elbow, and by the time she was old enough to be courted by the Yard's younger men, she had already decided, without much ceremony, that she preferred the honest company of good tools and careful work to the uncertain promises of most of the young men who came calling. She was not unhappy in that choice. She simply knew, the way she knew a hidden seam by touch alone, what kind of life actually suited her. Her mother had died bringing Clementine into the world, and so father and daughter built their small life together in the shadow of the Talbrook yard, close enough to hear the couplings clang and the switch engines huff through every season of Clementine's childhood. It was, in most ways, a contented life, though it carried within it a quiet sorrow Clementine only fully understood as she grew older. Her father walked with a permanent, halting limp, the legacy of an accident in his youth when he had still worked as a yard brakeman before turning to the gentler trade of trimming, an accident he almost never spoke of beyond a brief, tight-lipped mention that a coupling had failed to hold and had very nearly cost him his leg entirely. He carried, too, a deep and careful caution around the ordinary link and pin couplings that still joined most of the Talbrook line's freight stock, a caution Clementine noticed but did not fully understand until she was much older and began to notice how many other men in the yard walked with the same halting gait, or were missing fingers, or simply were not there anymore at all, their absences explained in low voices as a coupling accident, some years back, as though the phrase alone were sufficient to close the subject. Her father never told her the full reason for his particular horror of the old coupling system, only that he had once known a man, an engineer, who had tried to fix it, and that the trying had cost that man everything. Clementine grew into her father's trade herself as she came of age, taking over more and more of the mending and trimming work as his hands grew stiffer with rheumatism, and by 20 she had also picked up laundry and repair contracts with the yard crews directly, mending torn canvas, patching work coats, keeping the rougher edges of railroad life stitched together the way her father kept its passenger cars presentable. She was not, by nature, a woman inclined toward romance or grand ambition. She found a deep and sufficient satisfaction in work done well and unseen, in a torn seam made whole again so cleanly that no one would ever guess it had been broken. The yard men respected her, in their rough way, for her steady hands and her refusal to overcharge a struggling brakeman for a patched shirt, and she imagined, in the ordinary hopeful way of a young woman without much reason yet to imagine otherwise, that her life would continue much as it always had, useful and quiet and entirely her own. The accident that took her father from her, when it finally came, was not the dramatic kind the yard men still murmured about from decades past, but a slower, crueler unraveling. Micah's old injury had never fully healed, and in the bitter January of 1911, helping a young brakeman free a jammed coupling pin during an ice storm because the boy was too green to know better than to put his hand where his own scarred instinct screamed at him not to, Micah Ashworth suffered a second injury to the same ruined leg, a fall on the icy ballast that shattered what old surgery had only barely mended. He lingered 18 difficult months after that, his mending work dwindling to almost nothing as his hands, too, began to fail him from the constant pain, and Clementine nursed him and carried the shop alone through that whole slow decline, watching the small savings they had built over years bleed away into doctors' bills the railroad's company physician only partially covered. When Micah finally died in the summer of 1912, Clementine buried him beside her mother in the small trackside cemetery the railroad had grudgingly permitted its longtime employees, and told herself, in her rawest grief, that at least the cottage and the shop were paid for outright, the one certain thing her father had managed to leave her. She learned within the month how wrong she had been. Garrett Stroud, newly installed as division superintendent after his grandfather's long tenure finally ended in retirement, summoned Clementine to the yard office and informed her, with the particular brisk courtesy of a man reciting figures rather than delivering grief, that her father had in fact borrowed against the cottage some years before, during the worst of his medical expenses, a loan Clementine had never been told existed and could find no trace of in her father's careful, otherwise meticulous records. Stroud produced a note bearing what appeared to be her father's signature, called the debt due in full given the estate's obvious inability to pay, and within a month had the cottage, the mending shed, and every tool inside it transferred to the railroad's own accounts, offering Clementine, as a final gesture he clearly considered generous, continued laundry piecework at reduced rates if she cared to stay in Talbrook Junction at all. Clementine had no lawyer, no standing, and no surviving family to appeal to, and though she stared hard at that signature and felt, in some wordless part of herself, that something about its careful, unhurried loops did not match her father's usual quick, workmanlike hand, she had no way to prove a forgery against a superintendent's word and a properly stamped company ledger. She took a single room above the Talbrook Mercantile with her trunk of tools and her $6 remaining, and told herself, staring at the ceiling her first night there, that she would find some way forward, though she could not yet imagine what it might be. In those first hollow weeks, Clementine found herself returning again and again, in memory, to the sound of her father's mallet against a stubborn tack, the particular rhythm of it that had filled every ordinary evening of her childhood, and she understood, lying awake in a rented room that smelled of someone else's cooking rather than her own father's pipe tobacco, that she was grieving not only the man but the entire shape of the life his hands had built around her. She wrote, in a moment of raw and uncharacteristic hope, to a distant cousin of her mother's in Sedalia, asking only whether there might be room and honest work for a trained seamstress willing to earn her keep, and received, some weeks later, a brief and not unkind letter explaining that the household was already stretched thin and that surely a woman as capable as Clementine had always been described would manage well enough on her own. She read the letter once, folded it into the bottom of her trunk, and did not write again, understanding, not for the first time in her short life, that the people who spoke warmly of a woman's capability from a safe distance were not always the people willing to test that capability up close. She was standing at the edge of the rail yard scrap auction on a gray October morning some weeks later, not because she had any plan, but because the auctioneer's list had included, almost as an afterthought, several items of old rolling stock her father had once trimmed and cared for himself, and she found she could not stay away from watching what became of them. Most of the lots went quickly and cheaply to scrap buyers from Sedalia, until the auctioneer reached the last item on his list, a single derelict boxcar sitting on a disused siding at the yard's far northern edge, and read off its description with open amusement in his voice. Boxcar, condition unknown, wheels rusted solid to the rail after some 30 years of standing idle, immovable by any team or engine the yard had yet tried against it, sold as is, where is, buyer responsible for its removal by whatever means she could manage. A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd of scrap men, several of whom offered loud, unhelpful suggestions about dynamite, and Clementine, standing at the edge of that laughter with her father's old tool bag still in her hand from packing up the last of the shed, heard herself bid $2 before she had fully decided to. The auctioneer, startled that anyone would bid at all, brought his gavel down before the laughter could organize itself into a higher offer, and Clementine walked away from the yard that afternoon the owner of a rusted, immovable boxcar and precisely $4 to her name. The car itself, when she finally worked her way close enough to examine it properly, bore her father's trade in every line of its interior paneling, though the exterior had gone to rust and neglect decades before she was born. It took her the better part of a week working alone with penetrating oil, a mallet, and the same patient, unhurried care her father had taught her to bring to any stubborn seam, simply to force the sliding door loose enough to squeeze through, and what she found inside was a cargo compartment stripped bare except for a section of wall paneling at the car's far end that struck her, the moment her lamplight fell across it, as entirely wrong. She had spent her whole life learning to read the difference between careful work and hasty work, and this panel, unlike the plain, functional boards around it, had been fitted with the same exacting precision her father always praised, mitered corners, a seam so tight it was nearly invisible, wood selected and grained to match its neighbors so closely that only a trimmer's trained eye would ever pause on it at all. She knelt before it in the cold, dim compartment and understood, with a certainty that steadied her before she could even name why, that someone had built this panel to be found only by a person who already knew exactly what to look for. It took her 3 more days of careful, deliberate work to free the panel without damaging whatever lay behind it, prying gently at its edges with a thin blade the way her father had once shown her to lift a stubborn upholstery tack without tearing the leather beneath. When it finally came away, she found a shallow compartment built into the car's structural framing, dry and undisturbed, holding a canvas-wrapped bundle of drafting papers, a small leather satchel of tools unlike any she had seen before, and a slim, water-stained notebook whose first page bore a name in a careful, engineer's hand, Elijah Coombs. Clementine sat back in the dim compartment with her lantern guttering and felt the whole shape of her circumstances shift beneath her, understanding, with the same certainty she had once felt reading a hidden seam, that she had not simply bought a stuck, worthless car for $2. She had bought the answer to a silence her own father had carried for his entire adult life and never once fully explained. The notebook and its accompanying drawings took her the better part of a week to work through by lamplight, because Elijah Coombs had been, she came to understand, a mechanical engineer employed by the Talbrook and Prairie Line in its earliest years, and his account, once she pieced together its careful, technical prose, told a story far larger and stranger than anything she had imagined. In the early 1850s, Coombs had grown troubled by the mounting toll of injuries among the yard's brakemen and couplers, young men crushed or maimed coupling cars by hand between the heavy iron links and pins the whole industry still relied upon, a toll the company's own internal records, which Coombs had apparently copied out in meticulous secret, listed at nearly 24 serious injuries and 4 deaths in barely 5 years at the Talbrook yard alone. Working largely on his own time and his own modest savings, Coombs had designed and built a working prototype of an automatic coupling mechanism, one that would allow 2 cars to join simply by rolling together, without ever requiring a man's hand to enter the gap between them, a design decades ahead of anything the wider industry would adopt as standard. He had presented his design to the line's ownership in 1852, confident it would be embraced as both a humane and practical improvement, and had been refused outright by the company's founding director, a hard, cost-conscious man named Silas Stroud, who calculated in his own recorded correspondence, which Coombs had also secretly copied, that retrofitting the company's rolling stock would cost more than the ongoing expense of settling injury claims and hiring replacement brakemen, and who, moreover, feared that adopting Coombs's device would be read by rival lines and by injured workers alike as an admission that the existing system had always been unsafe. When Coombs pressed the matter further, appealing in increasingly urgent letters to the line's board, a coupling failure during a routine switching maneuver that same year killed a young brakeman named Henry Voss and badly injured another, and Silas Stroud moved quickly to lay the blame for irregular maintenance at Coombs's own door, dismissing him from the company's service and ensuring, through careful word passed to every rail line in the region, that no competitor would hire an engineer so thoroughly discredited. Coombs's notebook ended, its final entries increasingly bitter and despairing, with a brief note that he intended to seal his drawings and his working prototype somewhere the company could never quietly destroy them, in the hope that someday, someone with reason to look closely enough would finally understand what had truly happened, and why. Clementine understood almost immediately what she now held and how little that understanding alone would matter to anyone in Talbrook Junction. A 60-year-old engineer's notebook and a set of drawings were not proof that would move a company board or a division superintendent, particularly not when that superintendent was Garrett Stroud, great-grandson of the very Silas Stroud whose cold arithmetic had cost Elijah Coombs his career and, by Clementine's own quiet reckoning, had very likely cost her own father the ruined leg that shaped his entire life. If she was right about what Coombs's papers meant, she was holding evidence that could unravel 60 years of the Stroud family's unquestioned authority over the Talbrook line, and she had, once again, almost no one in the town who would believe a dismissed laundress with an old engineer's notebook over 3 generations of respected company management. She moved carefully through that autumn and into the following winter, telling no one what she had found, letting Talbrook Junction believe only that the strange Ashworth girl was stubbornly, foolishly trying to salvage scrap lumber from a worthless old car, a story the town found easy enough to accept because it required nothing further of anyone's conscience. By day she took in what mending work still came her way, careful to keep her modest, ordinary routine visible to anyone watching. By lamplight, she cross-referenced Coombs's drawings and correspondence against old newspaper files at the Talbrook Gazette office and against the yard's own surviving injury logs, records the company had never bothered to hide because no one had ever thought to look at them together, and found exactly what the notebook had promised, a documented pattern of coupling injuries stretching back decades, alongside board correspondence, still filed in the county courthouse's public land and business records, in which Silas Stroud's own handwriting calculated the cost of injured men against the cost of Coombs's device with a coldness that made Clementine's hands shake reading it by lamplight. She found, too, the name of Henry Voss, the young brakeman killed in 1852, and traced his surviving family to a modest house at the edge of town, where his granddaughter, a woman named Sarah Voss Tilley, still lived, and where Sarah's father-in-law, an elderly retired brakeman named Ambrose Tilley who had lost 3 fingers to a coupling accident himself in his youth, still told anyone who would listen that the old system had always been more dangerous than the company ever admitted. She thought often, during those quiet months of research, of Elijah Coombs himself, a man she had never met and knew only through one careful, increasingly despairing notebook, and yet whom she found herself understanding with a closeness that deepened each week. She pictured him working alone by lamplight on his prototype long after the rest of the yard had gone dark, carrying the particular loneliness of a man who has found a way to save lives and cannot convince anyone with power that the saving is worth the cost. She wondered whether his hands had trembled the way Ambrose Tilley's still did, decades later, recounting the accident that had taken his fingers, and whether Coombs had felt, in his final bitter weeks at the Talbrook line, the same mixture of grief and clarity Clementine now carried herself. She did not think of him, in the end, as the ruined and forgotten engineer the company's old dismissal notice had painted him, but as something closer to an unfinished colleague of her own father's, a careful, exacting craftsman who had done the hardest part of an honest job and been punished for it rather than thanked. There were evenings, working alone in the shed with Coombs's notebook open beside her lamp, when Clementine found herself speaking to him almost as though he might answer, asking aloud whether he had known, in those final bitter months at the Talbrook line, that his careful drawings would someday find a reader willing to finish what he had started. She began to notice, the more deeply she studied his work, a kind of quiet artistry in it that matched her own father's trade more closely than she had first realized, the same insistence on precision where no one would ever check, the same patient refusal to let a difficult problem be solved carelessly simply because carelessness was cheaper. She wondered whether her father had known Coombs personally in those early years before his own accident, whether the two men had ever stood together in the same yard discussing the very couplings that would eventually break them both in different ways, and though she found no direct proof of it in either man's surviving papers, she came to believe, with the same quiet certainty she trusted in her own hands, that some thread of shared conviction had passed from one craftsman to the other long before it ever reached her. Word travels strangely in a small railroad town, and though Clementine told no one directly what she had found, her sudden careful visits to the courthouse records room and her long afternoons at the Gazette's back files did not escape notice entirely. Garrett Stroud himself came to find her outside the Mercantile on a raw February afternoon, pleasant and unhurried in the particular way of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted, and offered, with every appearance of neighborly generosity, to buy the stuck boxcar and its scrap value outright for $10, 5 times what she had paid, framing it as simple charity toward a struggling young woman with no proper use for a worthless old car. The pressure did not end there. Over the following weeks, 2 of the Yard families who had quietly begun speaking with Clementine about old injuries in their own histories found their small company housing leases abruptly and inexplicably reviewed. The county recorder grew strangely reluctant to let her back into the older correspondence files, and one night in March, someone forced the boxcar's door and rifled through its interior, though whoever had done it had not known to look behind the false panel, which Clementine had by then long since resealed and hidden its true contents elsewhere. She understood she was running out of both time and patience, and that Garrett Stroud, whatever his private unease, would not simply allow a dismissed laundress with an old notebook to walk unopposed into a public reckoning. So instead of going first to the Railroad Commission, she went instead, on a cold spring evening, to the modest home of Ambrose Tilley, and told him everything, Coombs's notebook, the injury records, and the name of Henry Voss, his own daughter-in-law's grandfather, killed by the very system Coombs had tried and failed to replace. She watched the old brakeman's ruined hand tremble as he examined a drawing he had never known existed, a solution that had come 60 years too late to save the fingers he had lost or the young man his family had buried, and she asked him not for anger on her behalf, but for what only he and Talbrook's oldest railroad families could provide, their testimony, and whatever old letters or company notices they still kept from the years when the line's dangers were simply accepted as the ordinary cost of the work. It took the better part of 2 months to gather what she needed, sworn recollections from 4 families who had lost sons, fathers, or fingers to the old coupling system across 5 decades, the courthouse correspondence proving Silas Stroud's own calculated refusal, and Coombs's original drawings and prototype, all of it assembled with the same unhurried precision her father had once brought to a difficult seam. She timed her presentation for the Regional Railroad Commission's spring safety hearing, the one public session each year where grievances against the line's operating practices could formally be entered into record, and she walked into that hearing carrying Coombs's notebook, his drawings, and the sworn statements, flanked by Ambrose Tilley and 3 other Talbrook families whose lives had been shaped by injuries the company had never fully acknowledged. Garrett Stroud, seated among the line's management with the same unhurried confidence he had carried to her door that February, went pale and still as the commission's own engineer examined Coombs's 60-year-old design and confirmed, before the assembled record, that it anticipated by decades the automatic coupling standard the industry had only belatedly adopted, and that its rejection in 1852 had directly preceded a documented pattern of entirely preventable injuries the company's own files corroborated. Stroud argued, of course, that decisions made by his great-grandfather 60 years before could hardly be laid at his own door, that the company had long since adopted modern safety couplers in any case. But the commission was not there to judge old guilt so much as present obligation, and Clementine had learned, from a father who spent his life healing what other men's carelessness had broken, exactly how to let evidence speak plainly for itself. By the hearing's end, the commission had ordered a full independent review of the Talbrook Line's historical injury settlements, with any families found to have been inadequately compensated eligible for new claims against the company's own funds. What followed unfolded slowly, over the better part of a year, the way real justice in a small railroad town so often does, without a single dramatic reckoning, but without mercy either. The independent review confirmed nearly every injury Clementine's research had uncovered, and the company, its practices now under regional scrutiny, was ordered to establish a permanent compensation fund for affected families, administered independently of Stroud family oversight for the first time in the line's history. Garrett Stroud kept his position, since no law reached backward far enough to punish decisions made by a great-grandfather he had never known, but his authority over the yard's daily operations was quietly curtailed by the Commission's new oversight requirements, and the easy, unquestioned deference Talbrook Junction had shown the Stroud name for 3 generations thinned considerably once neighbors began recalling, with newly suspicious eyes, exactly how convenient the family's cost calculations had always been. Clementine used what remained of Coombs's own careful modest savings, still held in a small tin box within the hidden compartment, exactly as his final notebook entries had hoped someone might use it, dividing it among the families whose testimony had made the hearing possible, and keeping for herself only enough, once the commission settled her own father's old company loan as improperly documented and void, to finally reclaim the cottage and mending shed that had been her whole life's foundation. She reopened the shed not merely as a mending shop, but as something closer to what her father's whole quiet trade had always been in spirit, a place in Talbrook Junction where anyone, yard man or family member, could bring what was torn or broken and trust it would be mended honestly, without shortcuts hidden where no one would think to look. She kept Elijah Coombs's original drawings, carefully preserved under glass, hanging on the shed wall beside a small brass plate bearing his name and Henry Voss's both, not as a trophy but as a reminder of what patient, careful attention could still uncover, 60 years after everyone else had stopped looking. She thought often, working a fine seam by lamplight each evening, of her father's voice teaching her to find the hidden stitch, and of Coombs's careful, despairing hand in that 60-year-old notebook, and understood that both men had tried, each in his own quiet trade, to teach her the very same lesson, that the things people dismissed as ruined, stuck, or not worth the trouble of moving were very often exactly the things holding the truth that mattered most, waiting only for someone patient enough to work the rust loose. Clementine Ashworth, who had once stood at a railyard auction with $6 to her name while a whole crowd laughed at her for buying a car nobody could even move, became within 2 years one of the most quietly trusted women in Talbrook Junction, not because fortune had suddenly favored her, but because she had refused to let a rusted door, a company's old silence, or a town's easy laughter keep her from working loose what everyone else had simply decided was stuck for good. She never remarried, though she found herself, in the years that followed, welcomed at more tables in Talbrook than she had ever been before, the particular warmth extended to someone whose steady hands the whole town had come, quite genuinely, to rely upon. Ambrose Tilley took to telling any traveler passing through the depot the story of the laundress and the immovable boxcar, adding some fresh flourish to the tale each winter, though its heart never changed in the telling. And on quiet evenings, once the shed's lamp was the only light left burning on that stretch of Talbrook's main street, Clementine would sometimes take down Coombs's old notebook and read again its final hopeful line, written not in despair but in a kind of stubborn, patient faith, that some day, someone would finally look closely enough to see what had been hidden, and feel, every time, the particular, settled satisfaction of a debt 60 years overdue finally, honestly paid. She would think, on those evenings, of her father's ruined leg and Coombs's ruined career, 2 quiet men who had each paid a price for the same stubborn refusal to look away from what was broken, and she understood that in mending what remained of both their legacies, she had finally mended something in herself as well. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Clementine's story tonight. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs the reminder that the things the world calls stuck, ruined, or not worth moving are sometimes only waiting for a patient hand to prove otherwise. And we would love to know, what is a time you refused to let go of something everyone else had already given up on? Tell us in the comments below, we read every single one. Until next time, stay close.